right, welcome to Quick Media's Come Follow Me series. We are covering Doctrine and Covenants, sections 27 and 28. We will spend most of our time in this marvelous section 27. Very, very interesting section. As a whole, as we look at it, it's kind of like I use the thumbnail of this on YouTube as an example, or in the study group of King Arthur with the Knights of the Round Table. That's kind of what the feel I get with this section, is you have Christ bringing in all of these other heads of dispensations and important angelic figures that help to push forward the work. There's a kind of hierarchy there, right? Like King Arthur is like Christ, and you have these other knights that are noble at the, or supposed to be at least, noble at the table here. And what are they serving? They're serving the sacrament, right? This is about having the sacrament. This is the context of the revelation. It's kind of like a dead man's party, right? They're going to bring, Christ is going to bring everybody together here and partake again of the vine. And that's what this is about. It's about the sacrament and bringing things together, which is, as the sacrament is, it's a covenant. It's an ordinance, which is a covenant of bringing the higher and lower laws together, of bringing God and all of the levels of the implementation of the work on earth up to him. And that's what we see here. It's a lot like the creation we'll see. So if we go through the heading here on section 27, this is the first clue of what really is happening here. It says, revelation given to Joseph Smith the prophet at Harmony, Pennsylvania, August 1830. Again, just a few months after the organization of the church. In preparation for a religious service at which the sacrament of bread and wine was to be administered. Right? So Joseph had set out to procure the wine for the sacrament. That's when this comes. Remember, the Doctrine and Covenants are always reactions to events and questions that are in typically Joseph's head, right? Where things that happen and come up, he's going to have questions about this. He seeks guidance from the Lord, and boom, he gets the heavens opened and receives these revelations. So he sets out to procure wine, and he was met by a heavenly messenger and received this revelation. So this is direct from an angel. This is an angelic revelation to him. It's not through the Urim and Thummim. It's not through an answer to prayer. A portion of which was written at the time and the remainder in the September following. That's kind of interesting. Water is now used instead of wine in the sacrament services of the church because of this revelation. All right, so let's go down and see what this says. So in verse 2, the angel says to him, "For behold, I say unto you, that it mattereth not what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink when ye partake of the sacrament. If it so be that ye do it with an eye single to my glory," right, keeping your values hierarchy straight, "remembering unto the Father," that's in the both sacrament prayers, "my body, which was laid down for you, and my blood, which was shed for the remission of your sins." So this is an important thing. It doesn't have to be bread, and it doesn't have to be wine. And therefore, we use water. It's important to know that this is also something that happened in the past. You'll see examples in the Old Testament of water and bread being offered as a meal. Is it a ritual meal? It seems like it, oftentimes. The Essenes, right, at the time of Christ, they had a Thanksgiving meal. That's really what the sacrament is. It's a Thanksgiving meal. It's when you look at the prayers, right, and we're told to remember and to witness and to remember the sacrifice of the Savior, his body and his blood, it's a Thanksgiving prayer, and it's a prayer of gratitude when you think about it. That's what it is. We're renewing our covenants, but we're doing it in a spirit of thanksgiving and a spirit of gratitude. That's what the Eucharist is, if you've heard that term in other churches. It's a Thanksgiving meal, is what it is. Not turkey and mashed potatoes and gravy, but it's the spiritual meal of thanksgiving. But the Essenes used water in their meal. They used bread and water. So it's not unprecedented. I remember when I was on my mission once and I was really sick and I was out kind of in the boonies, and I called my mission president. I said, look, I have no bread. I want to take the sacrament. I'm sick as can be. And is it okay if I do the sacrament here on my own? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, well, just so you know, all I've got here are some cheap Mexican cookies, packaged cookies, right? And some drink that was called sangria, which is a soda pop. And he said, do it, right? And so I did. And so I had my sacrament with a cookie and with a packaged cookie and with this soda, which is actually made out of grapes. So it doesn't really matter what you use in the end, right? But he's told then not to purchase wine, neither strong drink from your enemies. That's kind of an interesting thing. Strong drink becomes a more and more of an issue in the church as we move on, and then we get section 89 with the word of wisdom. And then eventually in the first half of the 20th century, I believe sometime actually during Prohibition with the U.S., so with alcohol, I think that's about when that was added on to the temple questions. It wasn't on there before. Do you follow the word of wisdom was not on the temple questions prior to that, I believe. So he says, wherefore you shall partake of none except it is made new among you. Yea, in this my Father's kingdom, which shall be built up upon the earth. So again, here's our context for what we're going to get here with the rest of section 27, the sacrament. It's a meal of gathering. And that's really what we do. It doesn't seem that way when we are, taking a little piece of bread and a little plastic or paper cup of water. It doesn't seem like a meal. But that's what it is. If you think about the Last Supper, right? You had loaves of bread that was broken off of the loaf of bread and passed out, and then there was actually probably a single cup that was handed around of wine that was given to everybody. It was a communal meal. We don't look at it that way in the church very often, right? But that's really what it was a communal meal. I don't know how you guys handled things during COVID and when you may have been doing your sacrament at home or with someone else. But I did that, at home. I would have, we used non-bread, and so I would give out big pieces of it. And then we used teacups for the water, because what I wanted to do was make it more like a meal, a little bit more. And of course, the other thing is of course, when you're at home and there's usually 4 to 6 of us here, it's over like that, right? And I wanted some time for people to sit and think and ponder and go over things so they can do that while they're eating their bread and sipping their water. So that's how we did it. But he says this, as he says in the New Testament as well. He says, behold, this is wisdom in me. Wherefore marvel not, for the hour cometh that I will drink of the fruit of the vine with you on the earth and with Moroni. So interesting he brings up Moroni here, but it's kind of Joseph's compadre here. It's the guy that he's gone to, that he saw in his own room. He sees later in the field by the fence, and then of course for 4 straight years and more probably, he sees him at the hill Cumorah, and he's instructed by him. And so Moroni obviously is the one given the keys for the Book of Mormon, which is the tool to gather Israel. As we read through this section, we need to think about that creation of a gathering. And that's how we should look at it. As we go through this, again, we'll have a little bit of a creation theme in here. So he's going to drink with Joseph Smith. He's going to drink with Moroni from the vine. He's going to have the sacrament with him. Again, a communal meal. Think of King Arthur and the knights at the Round Table, sitting at the table and having this communal meal together. A meal of covenant, right? It's a meal of covenant. It's a meal of thanksgiving. It's a meal focused on the sacrifice of the atonement, right? So he says about Moroni, he is whom I have sent unto you to reveal the Book of Mormon. He has the keys containing the fullness of my everlasting gospel. We get that again here, another witness, another level again of telling us that the Book of Mormon has the fullness of the gospel. To whom I have committed the keys of the record of the Stick of Ephraim. Right. So again, this is Moroni is of course, Joseph Smith is the prophet of the last dispensation. Moroni is the one who holds the keys with the Book of Mormon, which is the Stick of Ephraim. And so that is a natural for him to be involved at this communal meal at in the last days, at the last dispensation. And again, the Stick of Ephraim becomes that much more interesting as we get in Isaiah, right? It's the Stick of Joseph or the Stick of Ephraim. But it becomes more obvious that the Book of Mormon is a Stick of Ephraim if, as we've learned recently in recent scholarship, if Zoram was an Ephraimite, if Ishmael and his family were Ephraimites. It appears that that's the case. So what you get is Ephraimites on both sides, both with the Nephites and with the Lamanites. You have Zoram, who marries apparently an Ephraimite wife, who is the daughter of Ishmael. So that's like all Ephraim, all in. And then Nephi and Laman and Lemuel all marry daughters of Ishmael, who apparently are Ephraimites. So you've got a mixing there of Ephraim and Manasseh. And then, of course, on the Lamanite side, you have the sons of Ishmael. So it is the Stick of Joseph all the way around. Both of those sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, both of those Josephite tribes, are perhaps equally represented, more or less. It's not just Manasseh. So the Stick of Ephraim makes all the sense in the world. The Stick of Joseph, of course, even makes more sense, perhaps. And then we start getting the list of these characters that are sitting at King Arthur's table, at the round table, so to speak. He says, and also with Elias. Okay, here we go again with Elias. To whom I have committed the keys, right? Another member that holds the keys here, another member of the table, of bringing to pass the restoration of all things spoken by the mouth of all the holy prophets since the world began concerning the last days. All right, now, I'm not going to touch on this a lot. I'll cover a few little things on it. I've already done an episode on this back with the New Testament, so I'll leave that in the description, that episode. But who in the world is Elias? Who are they referring to? I've heard and read a lot of LDS scholars talk about this. I am not convinced on any of it. It doesn't make sense to me who this is. Now, you think in reading this a little bit further that you know who it is, but let's wait and see here. If we go into verse 7, it says, and also John, the son of Zacharias. Interesting, because John is also called Elias, right, in the New Testament and in the Joseph Smith translation, which Zacharias, he, parentheses, Elias, visited and gave promise that he should have a son, and his name should be John, and he should be filled with the spirit of Elias. So this gets very confusing, because here you have who appeared to Zacharias at the temple to tell him about John, his son. Well, it was Gabriel. We get the term, the name of the angel is Gabriel, who we are told is Noah. And you say to yourself, oh, so Elias is Noah. Well, hold on. And then it says that he should be filled, that being John, the son of Zacharias, should be filled with the spirit of Elias. So here's Elias appearing, and that makes sense because John, the son here, is going to be an icon of the Aaronic priesthood, and he is going to be filled with the spirit of Elias that we are told later on is about being a forerunner, is about preparatory things, kind of like the Aaronic priesthood or kind of like the lower law, And he makes this specific again, tying it into the last days, which John I have sent unto you, my servants, Joseph Smith Jr. and Oliver Cowdery, to ordain you unto the first priesthood, which you have received, that you might be called and ordained even as Aaron. So that ties that in with the Aaronic priesthood. So what does Elias have to do with the Aaronic priesthood? I think that's a question we need to ask. Now, before I move on to Elijah here, who is a different person, in verse 9, we need to get some context on this, just a little bit. I'm not going to go fully into this. This is worth an entire episode, or worthy of an entire episode. What if we were to look at section 138, right? This is the one that is given by Joseph F. Smith about the work for the dead, right? And he sees all of these people that are the faithful, that are gathered in this one place, and that have been faithful in their testimony to Jesus while they lived in mortality, we're told. And that they are rejoicing together because the day of their deliverance is at hand, and they'll be able to be redeemed from the bands of death, right? So he goes through a number of the people that he sees that are like this. People that need the work done for them. And of course, just like our section 27 here, it's a lot of the people that are kind of like the knights of the round table, those that hold the keys. And so we get a list of these people. He starts off with Adam. Makes sense. He goes to Mother Eve. And then he talks about Abel and Seth were there. And then he says that he sees Noah. He sees Noah, right? And Shem, who he calls the great high priest. Many think that that is Melchizedek. Some issues on that. And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, right? So he gets through all these people. And then he comes down to here, verse 45 in section 138. Elias, who was with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. Who was with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration? This is very confusing. Well, was it John the Baptist, as it seems to tell us in the Joseph Smith translation of the New Testament? Or was it Elijah, which is what Elias is? Elijah is the Hebrew, and then transliterated into Greek is and English is Elias. So when we see Elias usually in the New Testament, which is in Greek, it's usually talking about Elijah. But Joseph Smith says, no, not always. Not always. There is a spirit of Elias, which is different from the spirit of Elijah. There is a person, he says, that is Elias with the Greek version, that is not Elijah. We think of the Seder meal, right, where the Jews celebrate each year, and they have that empty chair. For who? For Elijah. Elijah, who is the one who is preparing the way for the Messiah. And when he shows up in the chair, then that means the Messiah is coming. Well, wait a minute, that's a forerunner. So that doesn't make a lot of sense, because Elijah wasn't a forerunner. Elijah actually represents much more the Melchizedek priesthood because of the Abrahamic covenant, because of the sealing in the temple. That's more of a higher law thing. That's a Melchizedek priesthood thing. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, we've already mentioned Noah. So here separate is Elias. Is this John the Baptist he's talking about that was with Moses? Or is it Elijah that he's talking about? Well, it's not Elijah. Because in the very next verse, he says, and Malachi, the prophet who testified of the coming of Elijah. Right? So he's not just going in and out of Greek and Hebrew here for the same person. That's a separate person here in this context. Elijah is separate. Of whom also Moroni spake to the prophet Joseph Smith, declaring that he should come before the ushering in of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And then 47, the prophet Elijah was to plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to their fathers. And then we get into the temples and the ceilings in 48 and the work for the dead. All right, well, that's a common thing to see, is we see Elias coming right before Elijah. But Elias seems to be the lower law. Elias seems to be, for example, John the Baptist. He's often called Elias, or having the spirit of Elias. So who is the person Elias? We can also make a parallel to this with Melchizedek. Right? Melchizedek is a person. It is who Abraham paid tithes to, and who he receives the Melchizedek priesthood from, who Abraham receives the Melchizedek priesthood from. But it's also a title, right? Melchizedek is a righteous king. That's what Melchizedek means. And even Christ, Jesus Christ, is called the new Melchizedek. He's the new king of righteousness, and he has the Melchizedek priesthood. It is he that actually represents the higher law, the Melchizedek priesthood. So he's also a Melchizedek. If we look at Melchizedek as a title, even though he was also a person. In section 76, the vision of the 3 different degrees of glory, we get in verse 100. These are they who say they are some of one and some of another. So this is those that claim a prophet as kind of the head of their church, right? Some of Christ and some of John. We don't know which John that is. I'm not sure which John that is. Some of Moses and some of Elias. John the Baptist there would make sense, right? That would make sense there because you just mentioned John, and that could be John from the book of Revelation, right? In the book of John, the Gospel of John. And then we get this, which is very interesting. And some say Esaias, and some of Isaiah. And then it says, and some of Enoch, right? Here we have it again. Esaias is the Greek version of Isaiah, the Hebrew version. Yet he has them here as separate people. He's using a Greek spelling for Isaiah here as a separate person from Isaiah. When you see Esaias in the New Testament, you're talking about Isaiah. That's who they're referring to. But not for Joseph Smith all the time. Maybe all the time in the New Testament, but for Joseph Smith, Esaias is also a separate person. Just like Elias is the Greek of Elijah, and he sees them as there's also 2 separate people there. Even though Elias is also used as the Greek for Elijah, here he also has Esaias as a separate person from Isaiah, even though Esaias is oftentimes used as the Greek version of Isaiah, for example, in the New Testament. And if you go to section 84, you get Esaias again. It's not through Isaiah. It's not the name Isaiah. When you look through the, what is it? It's the lineage. Let's see. Yeah, it's the lineage of Moses' Melchizedek priesthood through Jethro, his father-in-law. And he goes through and he goes all the way back to Abraham and how Jethro received the Melchizedek priesthood. One of those names in there is Esaias, not Isaiah. So you can see Joseph Smith has done this again here. It's not just with Elias and Elijah. He has given a Greek name to, it appears, ancient people, where you would expect to get a Hebrew version of that. But maybe so that we can differentiate the people, I don't know. Maybe he uses a different name. In section 110, right, where you have all those that appear at Kirtland Temple, we'll get to that soon enough, he does the same thing. He in verse 11, he goes, after this vision closed, the heavens were again opened unto us, and Moses. He's also, Elias seems to oftentimes be associated with Moses. Not that Moses is Elias, but he seems to be mentioned right there with him. And Moses appeared before us and committed unto us the keys of the gathering of Israel from the 4 parts of the earth and the leading of the 10 tribes from the land of the north. Okay, and then he goes right into, of course, in verse 12, after this, Elias appeared. Right? So it's kind of like the Mount of Transfiguration. The name Elias is there with the name of Moses, and committed the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham. So this is someone who is responsible for the gospel of Abraham. Could it be Abraham? I don't know. Is Elias a title that would be given to Abraham? Who's responsible for the keys of the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham, saying that in us and our seed, all generations after us should be blessed. That sure has something to do, it seems, with Abraham and what is termed here as the gospel of Abraham. And then, of course, right after this, what name are you expecting to hear after Elias? In verse 13, after this vision had closed, another great and glorious vision burst upon us for Elijah. I mean, over and over again, we are shown that whoever he refers to as Elias is not Elijah. Whoever Joseph Smith refers to as Elias, right? These are separate people, and one Elias always comes before Elijah. Lastly, I'm going to go to section 77 here. In answering questions about the book of Revelation, one of the questions is, in verse 9, what are we to understand by the angel ascending from the east? Revelation 7th chapter and 2nd verse. And his answer is, and this is interesting, we are to understand that the angel ascending from the east is he to whom is given the seal of the living God over the 12 tribes of Israel. Wasn't that Moses? I mean, we see Elias is kind of there with Moses. But this gathering of Israel, it seems to be under Elias also, right? So he continues, wherefore he crieth unto the 4 angels having the everlasting gospel, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And if you will receive it, this is Elias, which was to come to gather together the tribes of Israel and restore all things. Who would be in charge of restoring all things? So Elias is someone that we find apparently several times, the person Elias, in the scriptures, according to Joseph Smith, maybe not by name, but he's not Elijah. And based on section 138, he does not seem to be Noah. Anyway, just a fun little rundown on the conundrum, which is Elias and Elijah. And this is something Joseph Smith was working on still and developing and getting new answers to through Revelation when he was killed, right? The idea, kind of codifying the idea of the spirit of Elias and the spirit of Elijah. He started to speak about this more toward the end of his life. And unfortunately, I think he was killed before he could fully get that information himself, or at least to relate it to us. All right, so back to section 27 here. Again, we've gone over Elias being one of the knights of the round table here, if you will. And of course, he's brought up right before we go into Elijah. So here in verse 9, we get Elijah, unto whom I have committed the keys of the power of turning the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, that the whole earth may not be smitten with a curse. Right? So another seat at the table for someone with the keys. Now, again, something interesting here. Again, a little bit confusing on this. If you go to the Joseph Smith translation of Malachi, that talks about the idea of turning the hearts of the children to the fathers. It's very similar to what we see here, where you have the hearts of the children turning to the fathers and the hearts of the fathers turning to the children. In the Joseph Smith translation, I believe it is the Joseph Smith translation, that changes. And in Moroni's explanation of this, or maybe that's the only place it is, I'm not sure, but for sure in Moroni's explanation of this to Joseph Smith, when Moroni first appears, right, in Joseph Smith's room, in his bedroom, he goes over Malachi and about this quote, but he says it differently. He does not say that the fathers turn to the children. He does it differently. He talks about turning back the hearts of the children back to the fathers. In other words, the way I see that is back to the Abrahamic covenant, back to the old ways, the original ways that had been lost at Sinai to some degree. Actually, before, but we get that event at Sinai where they chose to discard the higher law. They chose to mostly discard the Melchizedek priesthood. Because right here after that, it goes right into, and also with Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, your fathers, by whom the promises remain. Right? That's what we're looking back to. Those are the patriarchs. We're looking back to the patriarchal order. We're looking back to the Abrahamic covenant. And it's so interesting that they add Joseph in here, because usually we have the title, and that is a title, I believe, when we hear the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? That's a title that's specific to, I believe, talking about the Abrahamic covenant and the Melchizedek priesthood. Here we get the addition of Joseph in there, because we're talking about Moroni, and we're talking about the Book of Mormon, which is a Josephite record. And then we go all the way back with the keys here. We get in verse 11, and also with Michael, or Adam, the father of all, the prince of all, the ancient of days. And also with Peter, James, and John, whom I have sent unto you, by whom I have ordained you and confirmed you to be apostles and special witnesses of my name, and bear the keys of your ministry and of the same things which I revealed unto them. So these are all people that have a seat at the table, similar to what we get when we have the keys being brought and given to Joseph Smith at Kirtland in section 110. And that's what he says here in verse 13 of section 27. Unto whom, this is Peter, James, and John, under whom I have committed the keys of my kingdom and a dispensation of the gospel for the last times, and for the fullness of times, in the which I will gather together in one all things, both which are in heaven and which are on earth. There's our higher and our lower laws. So we can see a lot of this in that filter, right? And understanding that interpreter of the higher and the lower laws. We even get a little bit of a hint of this, I believe, when we're talking about Elias and Elijah. But this is about bringing everything back together into one. And this is my point about the creation. Think about the creation and how that works, right? It's like it's dispensational. Now, we get it in terms of days, or in Hebrew, the yoms, right? Yomim. This is a time period, but it represents the same kind of thing. At the end of each day, right, we get the Lord saying, and he saw that it was good, or in Hebrew, tov, which can also mean, in a sense, complete. That dispensation or that period or that principle is complete. And remember, in the creation, you're dividing things up, right? The light and the darkness, and the land and the water, and the different species of trees and plants, and different seeds of all kinds, and then different kinds of animals. And then, of course, Adam is divided as the rib is removed and woman is created. And so you get this whole thing of this separation, and then we start moving into a bringing everything back together. That's what Zion represents, is bringing everything back together to one. And we start that, in my mind, we start that with individually with baptism. And that's what the covenant of the sacrament is about, right? It's bringing heaven and earth together. It's sitting down for that communal meal. And then, of course, it moves on beyond that with the gift of the Holy Ghost, with temple marriage especially, right, where you've had the separation of Adam and Eve in the creation story, and then you have them being brought back together again in an eternal marriage, in a celestial marriage. We're talking about ordinances. We're talking about things that are of covenant. So when we make covenants and we promise to do this or we do that, what are we doing? We're taking what has been separated out, like in the creation. We're taking what has been separated in the fall, us and God, and we're bringing all these things back together into what? Into eventually, like, again, thinking of those four phases of the priesthood, from individual agency to individual speech and behavior, to family and marriage, to Zion, all being brought back together into one. That is what the intercessory prayer is about in John 17. Right? It's bringing everybody back together into one. And that's what I see here in section 27. It's this idea of going back to Adam and to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, bringing Moroni in, who holds the keys of the Book of Mormon in the last days, and Joseph Smith. And they're all sitting down together at this round table, so to speak, with Christ there as King Arthur, and having a communal meal together, the sacrament together, a covenant meal, something that means to bring together, which is what covenant is, covenere, to bring together. And we can look at the same idea with the days of creation, right? It's kind of like you're separated all these things, and we need to bring everything back together. Remember how we're told in section 76 how the earth will be as a celestial sphere? It's all flat as glass because everything's been put into one. There's no valleys, there's no mountains. That might be metaphorical, I don't know. But that's the idea, right? It's all brought back together into one. So he's going to sit down with all those individuals. It does also say in 14, and also with all those whom my Father hath given me out of the world. So that's all of us. So he's mentioning this hierarchical structure of these knights at the round table, of these key holders, and then all of us, right? Hopefully, if we are to be given to the Savior out of the world based on our decisions, based on our choices, and of course, based on his sacrifice. He then goes through the armor, right, that we get in Ephesians. I've got already an episode on that, so I'm not going to cover that here, that we also had in the New Testament. The one thing I will say about that in verse 15, the whole thing about the armor, how does it start off? Wherefore lift up your hearts and rejoice, and gird up your loins, and take upon you my whole armor. Lift up from where? Right? Lift up from where? The point is you're in a fallen state, you are in a carnal state, and you're lifting your heart up above those things, right? It's just, again, a lower law. We're reaching up to God. So you're pulling yourself out from a carnal state and trying to reach toward God. It's part of a covenant, just like the entire section is about. And then in verse 18, as it finishes up, talking about the helmet of salvation and the sword of my spirit, he says, I will pour that out upon you, and my word, my DBR. Remember that as we see this hierarchy of Adam and Abraham and Moroni and all these other knights at the table here, they hold the keys through the priesthood ordination, but they're also the ones who receive the word, the DBR, and put that out to others. Right, and so that's what we get here at the very end, summing this all together here, which I will pour out upon you, being the Spirit, and my word, which I reveal unto you. Well, that's what's come from all of these dead men at this party here, right? And be agreed as touching all things whatsoever ye ask of me, and be faithful until I come, and ye shall be caught up. That where I am, ye shall be also. Amen. Right, so that's all of us. We all have a seat at the table, and that is the plan of happiness. That's the plan of salvation. We all, because of a fluid hierarchy, can have unlimited progression. And the hierarchical structure that is put into place through priesthood and through how the DBR gets passed down to us is all for our good. And no matter where we fall in the hierarchy with anything, we could have a seat at the table, and we can have unlimited progression. Now, moving over to section 28, just a couple points that I want to discuss here. I think the way to look at this, let's go through the heading a little bit, so we have an understanding of what's happening and why this revelation was given. It says it's a revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet to Oliver Cowdery. This is in September of 1830, so we're moving along here in time frame. Hiram Page, a member of the church, had a certain stone and professed to be receiving revelations by its aid concerning the upbuilding of Zion and the order of the church. And several members had been deceived by these claims, and even Oliver Cowdery was wrongly influenced thereby. Right? Again, we see these problems with Oliver Cowdery, and we all might have had the same problems, but you can see some of the pride that gets involved with him. Hey, look what I've found. I've seen this. Right? I'm the holder of this mystery to some degree. And so this is very common. We see this is the same principle that comes out in every new dispensation. So of course it's here. And what is that principle? I want you to go back and think about Peter and Simon the sorcerer. Right? That is the same exact thing. I'm going to buy revelation. I'm going to buy the priesthood. It's a false priesthood. That's what that story is about. That is what this is. Hiram Page is Simon the sorcerer. It's the same thing. Now, why would that happen back then? Because the Lord is bringing about his proper authority and the proper channel and hierarchy for the priesthood and for the word, the DBR. So there's going to be natural opposition to this. Naturally, there are going to be other perversions of that hierarchical structure. And so here we have a perfect example. He's using a stone, just like Joseph Smith is using the Urim and Thummim and perhaps a seer stone in his reception of the Revelations, some of them here in the Doctrine and Covenants, and of course to translate the Book of Mormon. So here comes somebody else. Hey, look, here's what I have. Here's another stone. I have the authority here. I am able to receive this revelation. It's the same exact thing we get with Simon the Magi, Simon the sorcerer. And we get the same thing, if you think about it, back in another beginning of a dispensation. How about with Moses? What happens when they go to Pharaoh's court? And there's Moses with a staff, and there's the Magi, right? The magicians of which are that's really priests, the priests of Pharaoh, which represent what? A different priesthood, a different source of revelation. And they throw out their staff. And what is that story about? Well, they throw out their staff, it turns into a snake, right? And Moses throws out his staff, it turns into a snake. And then, of course, the snake from Moses' staff eats the other snake or snakes. What is that telling you? What is that? That is a threat to the priesthood. It's an opposition to the priesthood. And that's what is happening there. And the story is about the Lord and Moses being the direct line for revelation and for the DBR and for the authority of the priesthood. So of course we see this story here, and it actually comes up a couple more times. We can, if I remember, I'll touch on that. But this is right here in the beginning, in the first year of the church. Hiram Page is the magicians of the Pharaoh, or the priests of the Pharaoh. Same thing. Hiram Page is Simon the Magi, Simon the sorcerer. It's a natural consequence to challenge the authority. And it's a natural consequence for the authority of God, the true authority of God, to be shown as exactly that, the true authority. And the Lord just confirms this by verse 2. He says, "No one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith Jr., for he receiveth them as Moses," right? So again, that brings us directly back to the story of Moses and Pharaoh's magicians. In verse 3, "And thou shalt be obedient unto the things which I shall give unto thee, even as Aaron," which is really interesting. This is directed to Oliver Cowdery. Remember, Oliver Cowdery's already been told this back in, where was it, section 7 or 8, right? He had the gift of Aaron. And in fact, that might have been a staff. These things are all intertwined. But he had what was called the gift of Aaron. And here now he's moving outside of that. He's using the wrong staff, so to speak. He's using Pharaoh's staff when he's following Hiram Page here. So he's saying that Aaron, like Aaron was obedient to Moses, right? That Oliver Cowdery needs to be Aaron to Moses, to Joseph's Moses, to declare faithfully the commandments and the revelations with power and authority unto the church. This is not something that is just from, the authority doesn't come from man. We always learn that, right? The whole idea of the unhewn stone for the altar, the unhewn stone in the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, right? It's from God. That's what that means. It's not from man. And then showing the hierarchy again here in verse 6, speaking to Oliver, and thou shalt not command him who is at thy head, and at the head of the church. For I have given him, Joseph Smith, the keys. There's the keys, just like we were talking about in the last section. The keys of the mysteries and the revelations which are sealed, until I shall appoint unto them another in his stead. And of course, next is Brigham Young. In verse 8, quickly, Oliver is told to go on a mission to the Lamanites, which is interesting. He goes to the Native Americans of North America. Who are the Lamanites? Right? Who really are the Lamanites? Is it those that are Native Americans? Well, Joseph Smith seemed to think so originally. Is it the Central Americans? A lot of LDS scholarship now is focused on Mesoamerica. There's a lot of evidence for that. But is that the hub? Is that the focus of where the Book of Mormon geography is? I don't know. Personally, I don't care that much. Yes, it would be fun, but to me, it's candy, right? It's dessert. It's not the meat and potatoes. In verse 9, we're told that Zion will be built, the city of Zion will be built on the border by the Lamanites. And of course, that's supposed to be in Independence, Missouri. And then just as he gave in section 27 here, we can talk about this in the same way and the same root of the word, right, in Hebrew, DBR. In verse 13, we get for all things must be done in order, right, DBR. And by common consent in the church, by the prayer of faith. And that's kind of what these two sections really are about. It's the proper order. We get the layout of all of the Knights of the Round Table, an order. That's what you would call that, right? The Knights of the Round Table are in order. It's a priesthood. It resembles a priesthood, a hierarchical structure. And things are done in a certain way. There's day one of the creation, day two of the creation, etc. And originally, by the way, right, in day one, in the beginning, that is the council in heaven, in the premortal life. That's the council in heaven, when everything is together, when everything is brought together. And then as it comes down to earth, it's spread out, it's separated, and our job is to take what was once one in that council in the beginning, which is represented in the Holy of Holies, in the celestial room, and then bringing that back together. How do we do that? We do that through covenant, through coming together, through bringing things together. Anciently, the Hebrews used to have what they called the covenant of peace. And that's kind of what that represents, shalom, right, is this idea of everything being in its proper order and having been brought back together. I hope that gives you a different perspective on these two sections and that you've learned something here in this episode. I'll talk to you next time.